The darkness at the edge of a ghost station isn't empty. It is a thick, velvety weight that presses against your eardrums until you hear the ghost echoes of your own heartbeat. Arthur Vance knew this weight better than any man alive. As a senior track engineer for London Underground, he had spent 30 years navigating the deep level, the labyrinth of abandoned Victorian tunnels that the modern world had tried to forget. But tonight, the darkness felt different. It felt hungry. Arthur was inspecting a structural fissure near the old British Museum station, a platform closed to the public since 1933. The modern tube lines roared in the distance, a dull mechanical hum that reminded him he was still part of the 21st century. But as he stepped past a rusted iron gate, the hum vanished. The silence that replaced it was so absolute it felt like being buried alive. His heavy-duty LED torch cut a lonely path through the soot. Then, the beam hit something impossible. Where there should have been a bricked-up wall, there was an open platform. It wasn't the cracked, moss-covered ruin he expected. It was pristine. The tiles were a polished cream and maroon, gleaming under the flickering glow of real gas lamps that hissed with a rhythmic, wet sound. The air shifted. The smell of ozone and electricity was replaced by the suffocating stench of coal smoke, wet wool, and something sweet, like rotting flowers at a funeral. Then came the sound. A low, mournful moan of iron on iron. A steam whistle shrieked, a sound so sharp it felt like a needle piercing Arthur's brain. Out of the pitch-black tunnel emerged a locomotive. It was a Victorian masterpiece of black iron and brass, but it moved without a flickering light, cutting through the dark like a blade. The train hissed to a halt. The carriage doors, made of dark, polished mahogany, swung open simultaneously. "I'm dreaming," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. "Hypoxia. Not enough oxygen down here." But the cold was too real. It was a cold that didn't just chill the skin, it froze the soul. Drawn by a force he couldn't resist, a psychological gravity that pulled him toward his own doom, Arthur stepped onto the carriage. The interior was a nightmare of Victorian opulence. Blue velvet seats, gold leaf trimmings, and crystal lamps. But the passengers. Arthur's stomach turned. There were dozens of them, sitting perfectly upright. A woman in a widow's weeds held a bouquet of dead lilies, a gentleman in a frock coat stared at a newspaper, a young chimney sweep sat with his soot-stained hands folded in his lap. None of them breathed. Their skin was the color of wet ash, translucent and stretched tight over their skulls. As Arthur walked down the aisle, he glanced at the gentleman's newspaper. The Times. Wednesday, April 13, 1892. Suddenly, the train lurched forward. There was no gradual acceleration. It went from a standstill to a blurring, impossible speed. Outside the windows, the tunnel walls disappeared, replaced by a swirling vortex of gray mist and screaming shadows. Arthur ran for the door, screaming, "Let me out! Stop the train!" He grabbed the brass handle, but his hand passed through it as if he were made of smoke. He looked at his reflection in the window and let out a strangled cry. His reflection was aging. His hair, once salt and pepper, was now snow-white and falling out in clumps. His skin was wrinkling, turning into the same gray parchment as the passengers. "Ticket, please." The voice was like the grinding of stones in a graveyard. Arthur turned. Standing at the end of the carriage was the collector. He was 7 feet tall, dressed in a long, midnight black overcoat and a silk top hat. Where his eyes should have been, there were only 2 hollow, weeping pits of shadow. He held a heavy silver hole puncher that glinted like a tooth. The collector moved without walking, gliding down the aisle. He reached the woman in black. She held up a hand. He pressed the silver tool into her palm. A sickening click echoed, and a drop of black, oily blood fell to the floor. She didn't flinch. Arthur backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "I don't belong here. I'm not dead." The collector stopped. The eyeless pits turned toward Arthur. "The 4:15 express makes no distinction between the dead and the lost, Mr. Vance. You entered the station. You accepted the journey. I want to go back." Arthur sobbed, collapsing into a velvet seat. He felt the fabric begin to grow over his legs, the threads weaving into his skin. "There is no back," the collector rasped, leaning down so close that Arthur could smell the ancient dust of the grave. "London is a city built on layers. You are now in the foundation. You will ride until the city above is dust, and then you will ride through the dust." The train began to descend. The tracks tilted at a sharp angle, diving deep into the earth, far below the sewers, far below the tectonic plates. Arthur looked out the window one last time. He saw thousands of other ghost stations passing by, platforms filled with the victims of the Great Plague, the victims of the Blitz, the souls lost in the Great Fire. They were all waiting for their turn to board the express. Arthur tried to scream again, but his lungs were now filled with coal ash. He felt his consciousness fading, becoming a part of the blue velvet, a part of the iron, a part of the eternal silence. Back in the world of light, a search party found Arthur's torch and his hard hat lying on the tracks of the abandoned British Museum station. There was no sign of a struggle. There were no footprints in the dust leading away from the hat. The only clue was a small, circular piece of paper lying on the ground. It was a ticket, printed on heavy Victorian cardstock. It had no return date. And in the center, a fresh, clean hole had been punched through it. To this day, tube drivers on the Central Line claim that sometimes, when the tunnels are quiet at 4:15 a.m., they see a flicker of gaslight in their rearview mirrors. And if they listen closely, they can hear the faint, desperate scratching of fingernails against the back of their train, as if someone, or something, is trying to get back to a world that has long since forgotten his name. Deep within the fog-drenched moors of Yorkshire stood Blackwood Manor, a crumbling relic of the Victorian era. Its jagged stone gargoyles seemed to watch the approach of any visitor with a hungry intensity. Thomas, a historian specializing in ancestral tragedies, had been commissioned to catalogue the manor's vast, decaying library. The villagers at the local pub had warned him, the stones of Blackwood remember what the blood has forgotten, but Thomas was a man of logic. On his first night, the silence of the manor was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight. As he sat by the fireplace in the library, the temperature plummeted. His breath hitched in the air like ghostly silk. Suddenly, from the floor above, came the distinct sound of a heavy object being dragged across the floorboards. Scrape. Thud. Scrape. Thomas climbed the spiral staircase, his candle flickering wildly. He reached the master bedroom, but the room was empty. However, in the dust on the floor, there was a single, fresh trail, as if something invisible had been dragged into the wall. The second night brought the whispers. They didn't come from the hallway, but from within the walls themselves, hollow, scratching voices calling his name. When he looked into the grand hallway mirror, he didn't see his own reflection. Instead, he saw a tall, gaunt figure standing directly behind him, wearing a tattered funeral shroud, its face a void of darkness. He spun around, but the space was empty. Panic began to set in, but the heavy oak doors of the manor had swollen shut, as if the house itself was clenching its teeth. On the final night, the library's books began to fly off the shelves, their pages tearing like screaming skin. The floorboards beneath him gave way to a hidden cellar, filled with the skeletal remains of those the manor had claimed over centuries. Thomas looked up to see the shroud-clad figure descending from the ceiling, its elongated fingers reaching for his throat. The last thing he felt was the icy touch of a hand that had never known warmth. When the sun rose, the manor stood silent again, but a new book had appeared on the shelf, bound in fresh, pale leather, with Thomas's name embossed on the spine. In the coastal village of Dunwich, the North Sea air was always thick with salt and secrets. The marshes surrounding the village were treacherous, a maze of sinking mud and grey mist. Locals spoke of the marsh wife, a spirit that lured travelers to their watery graves. Elias, a cynical photographer from London, arrived during a particularly heavy fog, determined to capture the haunting beauty of the landscape. As Elias ventured deep into the reeds, the fog turned a sickly yellow. He lost his bearings almost instantly. The familiar sound of the distant waves was replaced by a soft, rhythmic sobbing. He followed the sound, thinking it was a lost child, but every time he drew near, the sobbing moved further into the deep marsh. He checked his camera's viewfinder and froze. Through the lens, he could see hundreds of pale, bloated faces staring up from beneath the shallow water of the marsh, their eyes wide and milky. Suddenly, a woman emerged from the mist. She wore a tattered wedding gown, soaked in black peat. Her skin was translucent, showing the blue veins beneath like a roadmap of decay. "Help me," she hissed, her voice sounding like bubbles rising through mud. Elias turned to run, but the ground beneath him turned into a liquid trap. He sank to his knees, then his waist. He looked back to see the woman hovering over him. She wasn't crying anymore, she was smiling, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. As he was pulled under by invisible hands beneath the surface, the fog filled his lungs. Years later, another photographer found a camera half buried in the mud. The final photo was not of the landscape, but of a man's hand reaching out from a sea of black slime, and a pale face in the background, waiting for the next visitor.